This morning's sermon is brought to you by Sports Direct and Honey and Lemon. So, a very familiar passage again. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. So let's remind ourselves of the text before we begin. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odour, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Now, it's been a while since we reminded ourselves of the overall purpose of the Gospel of John, the reason that John is writing these accounts of Jesus for us. And we find that in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. So John 20, verses 30 and 31. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written, that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. The signs that he did all had this fundamental purpose: that those who experienced them, those who saw them, those who heard about them, and those who read about them might believe that Jesus is the one that the Father sent. That he was the answer to the problem of separation from God. This, what we read today, is the final miraculous sign that Jesus will perform. And let's remind ourselves of the context before we look at what actually happened here. Jesus has heard that his friend Lazarus, his good friend, his close friend, whose family Jesus is also close to, he hears that this dear, dear friend of his is sick. So Jesus, the miracle working, the healing of disease man that he is, does the only right thing. He stays where he is for another couple of days. But in doing so, very specifically tells us why this is all going to happen in the way that it does. He tells us, like Yahweh or Jehovah in the Old Testament, not only what is going to happen in the future, but the reason for why it happens. And what happens? What sets us up for today's text? Lazarus dies. This man is no more. He has ceased to be. He's expired and gone to meet his Maker. He's a stiff. Bereft of life, he rests in peace, pushing up the daisies. His metabolic processes are now history. He's off the twig, he's kicked the bucket, he's shuffled off this mortal coil, run down the curtain and joined the choir invisible. This is an expat man. Nearly. But why does that matter? Because what Jesus does, he does to show both the glory of God and who he is as the chosen of God, the one sent from the Father. He doesn't make people with tired eyes see a little better. if they squint and concentrate. He heals the eyes of a man born blind. He doesn't make people with a bit of a back twinge, fairly positive that it feels a bit better. He completely removes leprosy from those people who have been shunned by their community because of their disease. And he doesn't turn up just as Lazarus awakens from some complex neurological disease that has now righted itself. He waits until Lazarus is good and dead, the stinky kind of dead. As far as the Jews were concerned, it was after 3 days that the spirit of a person departed from where they were. Why did Jesus delay? Why did Lazarus die? Why? A question parents of young children are obviously very familiar with. But we've been here before, in a sense. In chapter 9, the disciples want to know why this man was born blind. Was it his sin or that of his parents? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Our answers to the why questions can easily overlook one simple truth, and one that is undeniable here with Lazarus. God does what he does in the way that he does for his own purposes. Now that can be a hard thing to accept in our own experiences. God allows what he allows even when we can't see what he is achieving through it, what his purposes are. Sometimes we can see later, we can look back upon something and recognize why, but sometimes it won't be until eternity that we can fully understand what God achieves through the things that we endure. Look at the experience of Joseph in the book of Genesis. He was betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, accused of attempted rape, ends up in prison, forgotten by the outside world for an extended period before everything turned around for his good. When he meets his brothers many years later, he can tell them, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. It was literally years until he could look back upon what happened and see the hand of God actively at work right from the moment he was betrayed. As I already pointed to, in this case we know the why. We go back to verse 4 of the chapter, of this chapter. When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Verses 14 and 15 of chapter 11. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. And for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe." But let us go to him. And verses 25 and 26. Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die." Do you believe this? The Apostles' Creed that we declare together on a regular basis, reminding us of the shared faith of genuine Christianity, the thing we've already shared this morning, in fact, is where we say, "I believe in the resurrection of the body." But what we see in our reading is not that. Not in its fullest sense. We sang yesterday morning at the meeting Duncan mentioned earlier of the fact that through Jesus, death has lost its grip on me. Yet Lazarus was still under the physical grip of death. His body was aging again, heading back towards death from the moment that Jesus called him out of his tomb. The resurrection of Lazarus points not at our hope and expectation, as though we will experience what he did, but at the power of Jesus. The resurrection that we experience will be the forever kind, with a new kind of body. What we see here in this passage is that death itself is not an obstacle for Jesus. Even as we recognize that the final victory over death was not won until the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ himself. Now, something various commentators have mentioned, a little tongue-in-cheek, I think, is how important it was that Jesus called Lazarus' name specifically when he commanded, "Come out." Otherwise, it's entirely possible that every tomb within hearing would have been empty of its dead. The point they make is that Jesus had the power to make that happen with a word. This whole event has one purpose: to demonstrate the identity and power of Jesus. He is the resurrection and the life. It is within himself. And what he does here shows that. Now, recognizing both his identity and his power from this text as well as those that have gone before means that the death he is marching towards takes on a whole new depth. He is not killed because he is guilty, but despite his perfect nature and perfect obedience to all that God has said. And he is not killed because he is weak, but because he lays aside his life willingly, refusing to exercise his power to prevent his death. Regardless of his power, the other thing that we note in today's text is this: he doesn't do for the people around him what they can do for themselves. Only he here could raise the dead, but they are capable of moving the gravestone, and they are called upon to unwrap Lazarus, who was probably at this point a little confused as to what was happening, and who nobody was actually trying to help while he was stuck there in his grave clothes. In verse 41 it says, "So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, 'Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me.'" As Jesus prays, he demonstrates the reality of what he has said before. He does nothing by himself, according to his own desires. He knows that God hears him because he knows that what he does, what he says, and what he asks are always according to the will of the Father who sent him. Our aim when we pray is not to twist God's arm to do what we want, but desiring to see God's purposes worked out. What did we see with Jesus delaying when he heard that Lazarus was sick? We see him acting not according to what the disciples thought best, nor according to what Mary and Martha wanted, but according to what the Father was going to achieve. Lazarus had to die. Now, keep in mind, we never see Jesus ask the Father to raise Lazarus, so we shouldn't assume that's what he's referring to in these words. Jesus did speak of being glorified because that was God's purpose. That's what was being achieved. The fact is, we don't know what Jesus is specifically referring to when he says the Father heard him, though we can assume it was some form of request, because that's what the language points to. But neither Jesus nor John are overly focused in the text that we have on giving us that detail, because it's not the point. Our takeaway is to be the point that has been made already in the book that we call the Gospel of John. Namely, that the will of God, his purpose, is foundational to whatever we ask. We can ask for, claim, believe for whatever we like. But the heart we need is one that says, your will be done. Jesus, as the one sent by the Father, embodied this attitude, which we'll see more powerfully in the crucifixion and in the events immediately preceding it, such as in the Garden of Gethsemane. And it is part of the evidence that he is who he claims to be. Jesus lives in obedience to the Father, and the Father glorifies him. How do we know this is in mind? Jesus' own words. I knew that you always hear me. He's not suggesting that God is sometimes deaf or ignorant, distracted in some way by what's happening in the world, but he's pointing to the positive nature of their relationship, where Jesus' consistent desire is to do what the Father wants. So he knows there is never a moment of division or divergence between the two of them. This is why he talks elsewhere about only doing what he sees the Father doing. And that is to be the attitude that we seek, the desire that we have. And those are the takeaways from this text. There is other things that I could bring out of it, but those are the main points. Jesus is the Christ. If nothing else from today's text stays with you, this should. This is the main point. If the writer John was sitting in the front row where Peter is, and the one thing I preach from this text is that Jesus is the Messiah, the one that the Father has sent to take away the sin, the stain of rebellion from those who believe in him, then he'd say, yes, that's it, that's the point. But secondly, we see that Jesus did not do for those around him what they themselves could do. Now, it's not wrong to ask God in specific circumstances to act in a particular way. But keep in mind that his answer might be telling you to, figuratively speaking, roll the stone away or unwrap Lazarus' grave clothes. And lastly and vitally, seek God's purposes and not our own. Aim for his glory and not our own. And always keep this thing in mind. God is not bound to do things in the way that we would. Amen.